I'm excited for today's presentation, and you all should be too. With us today, we have Dani Johnson. Dani is co-founder and principal analyst for RedThread Research. She has spent the majority of her career writing about conducting research in and consulting on human capital practices and technology. Before starting RedThread, Dani led the learning and career research practice at Burson Deloitte, and her ideas can be found in publications such as our own here at CLO Magazine, as well as Wall Street Journal. So it's our pleasure to have Dani with us. I know she's got a lot of great information to share with you today. So Dani, let's get into it.
Thanks, Alec. I'm really happy to be here just to discuss some of the research that we recently done on learning technology ecosystems. Just a little bit about how this research came about. We've been hearing the term learning ecosystem for a long time, like five or 6 years now. And so we decided to see what people were saying about it. When we did an initial review of the literature that has been written on it, it turns out that while a lot of people are talking about it and a lot of people are saying that they're necessary, there was hardly anything written about how to actually create one. So we've spent the last 4 months talking to really smart learning leaders about what their ecosystems look like and what strategies they put in place in order to build them. And they have been incredibly generous with both their time and their candor. In most cases, they laid out their ecosystems. They just kind of laid everything bare and let us see what was behind the curtain, and provided really detailed information on what they use for learning. So what I'll be sharing with you today is kind of a culmination of those conversations. We had about 35 of them, and got some really good information. So just really quickly, we usually don't do this, but in this case, I think I'm missing a slide, but that's okay. So I want to talk a little bit about ecosystems in general. There has been kind of an uptick in the discussion of ecosystems, and it's a bigger conversation for basically 2 reasons. And those reasons are, first, expectations have increased, and second, choice. There's a lot more choice than there has been in the past. So let's talk first just about those expectations. From an expectation standpoint, organizations just need better results. There's been a huge acceleration in innovation and technology. Businesses are moving faster, and the old way of training is really pretty antiquated, and it's way, way, way too slow. In a lot of cases, in organizations that haven't adopted this new way of thinking, the L&D department is actually a bottleneck to developing new skills and knowledge, which is interesting because that's their main purpose. And so we're seeing a lot of L&D leaders scrambling with these new expectations to provide faster, more personalized development. And the interesting thing is that we're also starting to see a shift in how organizations view this task. So in the past, L&D has always
Hey, Dani, if you can hear me. There you are. We dropped your audio there for a second.
How far back did you drop it? Do you know?
About 15 seconds ago, I'd say.
Okay. All right. So one of the interesting things about this new focus on learning and development in organizations is that learning leaders tend to have the support that they need from their leadership. So 27% of L&D leaders state limited budget as a top challenge, which is fairly low. And then 82% of those same learning leaders report that leadership actively supports learning programs. So it's getting much easier. We just need to figure out how to do it a little bit better. The other expectation that's changing quite a bit is that employees want better experiences. And this, again, is data from that LinkedIn workplace report. 68% of employees want to learn at work. 58% prefer to learn at their own pace, and 49% prefer to learn at the point of need. So everybody wants better experiences. We've been talking about this for a while as well. Employees can get better experiences outside of the workplace than they can normally get inside. And so it's kind of messed with the stability in the L&D department that we've had for a while. We think these numbers are growing and may represent a little bit of shift in demographic. We have younger workers entering the workforce. and they may learn just a little bit differently, but we also think that it's a change in the way that we view work. It's faster paced. We need to learn in place a little bit more. More personalization is needed in order to get the learning done. So
Danny, I'm not sure if you can hear me here, but we lost your audio again. There is a tab on your control panel that shows audio. If you're able to, could you please call in with a phone rather than using your computer audio?
becoming incredibly, there's lots of choices out there, and these choices are making it more difficult for L&D leaders to figure out how to make sure that these things are coming together. Just one more slide on that. As we look at these vendors and as we talk to these vendors, they're going to market in about 30 ways. So we're not just talking about LXPs versus LMSs anymore. We're actually talking about a variety of things that these vendors provide that further confuse how we would put together an ecosystem and make it cohesive and serve the needs of our organization. So with those ideas in mind, the fact that the expectations on the learning department are higher, and also the fact that we have more choice than ever before, we went into these discussions trying to figure out how organizations that had solid learning tech ecosystems were doing it. And basically four basic ideas or principles came out of that. The first one is philosophy, how you think about it. The second one is structure, how those things are connected. The third one is sustainability, or how you make sure that things are working the way that they should and remain working the way that they should. And then that fourth one is evolution. How are you evolving as you need to in order to meet the needs of the organization? So we're going to go through each of these just very briefly. And let's start with philosophy. So as organizations begin to adapt more technologies for learning, they need to develop a philosophy. We can no longer just plug and play things. We actually have to think holistically about what we're putting together. We need to intentionally create what we need. And in a lot of the organizations that we talk to, that means moving from the idea of providing to one of enabling. And let me talk just a little bit about that. So this probably looks familiar to a lot of you. This was the world as it existed 5 years ago. So when we talked about learning technology, we talked about technology categories. We talked about the learning experience platforms and the microlearning platforms and the content libraries and the LMS platforms, and everything that we did or bought or purchased, or the RFPs that went out, were sort of focused on these things. These are sort of line items that we see in our budget. But the thing is, last year when we took a look at the market and in the conversations that we've been having with learning leaders, it looks a little bit different. So all of the vendors that are out there that are providing these types of functionalities, think in terms of what can we do for the organization, not necessarily in terms of what are we. What category do we fall in? And as we talk to those vendors, and then as we also talk to the organization leaders, it turns out that they're very concerned about experience, and then they're concerned about just making sure that the trains stay on the tracks. And within that experience, there are 6 things that they need to enable their learners to do, their employees to do. The first thing is they need to help them plan. So in the past, when things were a little bit slower and we had a better idea of how people moved through organizations, we provided somebody a curriculum and that was it. But today, learners learn everywhere. They learn what they want to learn. They have different career desires than traditional paths. And so we need to help them plan what they want to do, how they want to learn, and how they're going to do it. The second one is discover. We need to help them discover. And this goes back to the conversation we've been having for a few years about curation. How do we help them find the content and the skills, but also the opportunities that are going to be most useful to them to develop the knowledge and skills that they want for their career, but also that the organization needs. The third one is the one that most L&D organizations are most familiar with, and that's consume. How do we help them consume the content or the experiences that they need in order to develop? That is generally content. The fourth one is experiment. We're seeing an uptick in the number of technologies that help individuals experiment with new knowledge and skills. The fifth one is connect. How are we connecting individuals to other individuals that can help them learn? The roots of this one actually was this idea of social learning and learning from peers. And then that sixth one is perform. How are we actually helping employees perform better, and how are we helping them learn on the job while they're doing that? And then at the far right of that screen, there are two that we just do to keep the train on the tracks. We manage the learning that's happening. We need to keep track of it and make sure that it's happening. And then the second one is create. There is some content that we create. How are we doing that, and what tools are we using to do that? And then that very last one is analyze, which has become much more important than in the last few years. This is how are we doing that measurement, and how are we making sure that the things that we're putting into place to enable people help them. And the interesting thing about this particular model is that when we take a look at all of the functionalities that vendors are offering in the marketplace and all of the functionalities that organizations are looking for, they fall pretty nicely into these 8 buckets. So under plan, there's career planning and skills tracking. Under the analyze bucket, there's LRS and surveys and evaluations and analytics. And so when we align all of those functionalities to what we're actually trying to accomplish, this is what we get. So the first thing, again, is enabling versus providing. We have moved away from providing all of the content, which just falls in this consume bucket, and we're talking instead about enabling learning in the organization. L&D cannot move fast enough to make sure that everybody in the organization has skills and knowledge. So we need to enable and deputize pretty much everybody in the organization to make sure that that happens. The second thing that we're seeing as far as changes in philosophy is this idea of designing, not assembling. So as we've moved away from just having one platform for learning, organizations are actually intentionally designing learning tech ecosystems. And we heard 3 basic things when it comes to designing, not assembling. The first one is simplicity. We heard more than one leader say, we need to create a signal through the noise. There's so much content out there, and there are so many places to go to learn. How do we create a signal so that they understand what's really important, so that they're getting what they need, but also what is going to help our organization grow and learn? The second one is accounting for all employees, and I was surprised at how often this one came up. There are lots of really fun, new, shiny technologies out there. In a lot of cases, organizations that deal in other parts of the world or have multi-generational workforces struggle with using some of those new technologies because they either don't land, or there's not the bandwidth available to run some of those things, or they have other constraints. And so one of the challenges that these forward-thinking companies was looking into is, how do we create an ecosystem that works for everybody, not necessarily just involving the new, shiny, really cool things that we'd like to put in it. And then that third one is all tech, not just learning tech. And so we know that people learn everywhere through all kinds of tools. We identified basically 3 types of technology that people are using in their ecosystems. The first one is purchase technology. So technology that ends up on the balance sheet of the L&D department that you buy specifically for it. The second one is accounting for all employees. The second one is adopted. So in organizations, there's technology that we use that isn't necessarily specifically for learning. And those things are things like Workday. We heard Workday a lot. We heard the Google Suite a lot. We heard Slack and Teams and those types of things that are adopted by the organization and then adopted by the learning department for learning. And then that third group is enabled. And the reason that we include this one, some people are not on board with us including this one, but there are these technologies out there that enable people to learn wherever they are, that cannot be tracked by the L&D department and can't necessarily be adopted by the L&D department. Things like WhatsApp, we heard a lot, things like YouTube. And so the job of the L&D department there is to acknowledge that they exist and to make them usable within the organization without really having any expectations about the data that they can gather from that. And that's a hard pill to swallow sometimes, but one that is becoming increasingly important as people take charge of their own learning. Just a quick example, this is a tech ecosystem of a small company called Centric Consulting. And the reason that I throw this one up here is I was surprised when I was talking to them. I guess they're not a super small consulting organization, but they're fairly small. And the learning leader there doesn't have a huge budget. but she's been very deliberate in the way that she's designed her tech ecosystem. And the thing that's really surprising to me is the number of things that fall out here in the adopted tech space. So she's leveraging as much as she possibly can that those technologies that surround learning that aren't necessarily purchased for learning to make sure that learning is happening in her organization. The second consideration for developing a learning tech ecosystem is structure. In talking to a lot of leaders, we realized that there are basically three main structures that we saw for these tech ecosystems. The first one is what we're calling a one platform. And the way that we're describing this, it's kind of an inside joke, but everybody, all the technologies that we talked to, all the vendors that we talked to wanted to be sort of the front door of learning. So in the case of the platform, we describe it as one door, one room, which is basically all learning theoretically takes place in one place. All the learning is in one place. And organizations that consider themselves sort of the one platform structure usually choose something like an LMS or some other large technology with a lot of functionality in it in order to be that one place, one room for learning. Interestingly, though, even those organizations who said that they were just a one platform organization, when we started walking through some of those other functionalities and some of the other things that they were enabling, they realized that they were using significantly more technologies than they originally thought. In fact, I think the average for the number of technologies and functionalities used by the organizations that we talked to was 11, which is pretty high. 11 technologies that they acknowledge for learning in their organization. The second structure that we ran across was what we call the central system, which is one door, several rooms. So there's a central tool that acts as sort of the front door, and then other tools are integrated and accessed through that central tool. And in general, that central tool is something like an LMS or an LXP. Sometimes it's depending on the type of organization it is, it could be a MOOC or a cohort platform. And then the organization augments by adding sort of functionality around that central tool. Most organizations still consider that one central tool as the front door. They say we send everybody here and then they can access these different things once they get there. But there's that central hub in place to make sure that they're sending sort of that signal through the noise. And then the third one we saw, and honestly, we did not see very many of them, but the third one was a pure ecosystem, multiple doors and multiple rooms. Employees access what they want, how they want, when they want it. Not many organizations fall here, but we're seeing kind of a push toward this pure ecosystem, integrating in with the work itself and the tools that they use for work, rather than going to one place for learning. It's a different mindset, but one we're seeing a little bit more of. And interestingly, when we looked at all three of these together, we saw that they fell kind of on a spectrum. And the structure really matters. The structure you choose really does depend on the characteristics of your company. And what we mean by that is when we were looking at those one platform organizations, they had similar characteristics. So they often had similar workforces, which means they weren't dealing with a lot of extra languages. They were kind of a homogeneous work group who all had sort of the similar needs. There tended to be lower tolerance for risk by the L&D department, and sometimes in general in the larger organization. Sometimes there's just not a lot of room to move around in the learning space, and so low tolerance for risk was another one. The third one was org-driven development. So these tended to be organizations that understood how people moved through their organization, and there wasn't a lot of sort of deviation from that. Heavy focus on compliance, and then low budget flexibility. And what we mean by that is one of the sort of side discussions or things that we want to explore a little bit more is it used to be that you'd get $10 million every 10 years to renew your LMS or to fix your LMS. We're seeing more budget flexibility happen. So it's not just amounts of money, but it's also the cadence in which that money is sort of granted to the L&D department. In the case of a one platform, there's kind of low budget flexibility. However, when we look at the pure ecosystem side, we're seeing kind of the opposite of those things. So pure ecosystem works where there are really varied workforce and where different people are going to enter systems at different times to do different things in really different ways. there tends to be a higher tolerance for risk, so we see a lot more experimentation in the pure ecosystems because there's less of a problem with that. Employee-driven development like crazy, so they're encouraging people to learn wherever and whenever they can. There's a heavy focus on sort of exploration. It's not sort of determined by the organization, but they explore and do what they need to do. And then high budget flexibility. To do a pure ecosystem, it takes a little bit of a different mindset when it comes to budget as well, because people can either people can plug things in or take things out depending on the needs of the organization and react much more quickly. If you're curious about where most of the intentional organizations we talk to sit, they're somewhere between a central system and a pure ecosystem. So they recognize the central system as necessary today to do what they need to do, but they're increasingly moving toward that pure ecosystem and integrating with the work itself. An example of this. This is an example of an organization that sort of subscribes to the central system. There's a multinational manufacturing organization out there, and their main goal is to make it easy as possible to help people find what they need to find. And so they use a couple of central technologies. They use their LXP for sure, but then they also use their cohort platform. And through those two systems, they guide employees toward the knowledge and skills that they need. And then they try to incorporate these other technologies in with those two systems to cut down on the noise dramatically, to make sure that they're guiding people in the direction they need the organization to go. The third idea, or the third factor that organizations should take into account when they're designing a tech ecosystem, is this idea of sustainability. Leaders were really clear on the fact that it took more than just the L&D department to get the learning tech ecosystem where they were going. And they talked specifically about two types of sustainability. They talked about internal and external sustainability. So internally, they talked about involving stakeholders to make sure that whatever was put into place was leveraged the best way that it could be, and that they were getting all of the information that they needed in order to make the best decisions about technology. So as it says on the screen, good ecosystems don't just happen. It takes a lot of collaboration and cooperation. And we basically saw 5 stakeholders that organizations should pay attention to when they're building their ecosystem. The first one is senior leadership. Obviously, they hold the purse strings, but beyond that, positive support from the senior leadership and an understanding of the importance of what you're doing really helps to build it into the culture rather than having it as a standalone thing on the side of the organization. The second thing were HR partners. Most L&D functions still report up through the HR function. And so getting leadership as well as business partner support or on board with what you're doing is key to success. Third one is probably obvious, but I'm amazed at how often the relationship between L&D and IT functions is a little bit strained. Your relationship with IT can make or break an ecosystem. It can allow you to experiment, or it can force you into a 10-year agreement with an LMS that you don't love. Being their friends, letting them know what you're thinking, getting them to help you experiment will make that relationship stronger and help you come to a common purpose in order to get that technology the way that you want it. We also heard a lot about embedded L&D. A lot of the organizations that we talked to had a central hub that either facilitated or made buying decisions for larger technologies that would be used throughout the organization. And so getting the opinion of embedded L&D to understand what they need, the needs of sales, for example, may be completely different than the needs of manufacturing. So understanding what those needs are and building all of those into the learning tech ecosystem is key. Especially when it comes to multinational corporations, different languages, bandwidth issues, et cetera, kind of like we talked about before. And then the final user group there that we should be paying attention to is the actual users, or the employees. It's probably not a surprise that this one is here, but we heard a lot of organizations tell us that understanding what the experience was from the user standpoint was really important, and making sure that they were getting what they needed to get out of it was key to making sure that the ecosystem was fulfilling its destiny. The other thing that we heard as far as sustainability goes is this idea of external sustainability. And this had to do a lot with is this small tech vendor that I'm working with today going to be here in 3 years? Or do I need to go with somebody a little bit more established to make sure that my ecosystem isn't going to fall apart? This tends to be very important for organizations that are using either one platform or the central system configuration, because if those systems go down, it's a much bigger deal. And so even those that were using the central system platform said, yes, we vet those very carefully, and we're very careful about the technology that we put in the middle, but we're a little bit more flexible about the things on the outside. The 5 things that we heard that people are using to vet their vendors were these 5 shown on the screen. The first one is customers with similar challenges. Vendors will provide references, and they'll also provide case studies of some of the great work that they've done. But if those customers don't have similar challenges, it's hard to rely on their word that they can meet your needs as well. So understanding which customers they have that have similar challenges and talking to those people is important. The second one is the confidence of investors. I don't know that I would have said this 5 years ago, but there's a lot of investment in the venture capital from venture capital into learning technology today. And so understanding the types of technologies that they invest in and having confidence of the investors is a good sign that the organization and the technology is going to be around for a while. The third one, and this one is probably my favorite, is a robust and innovative roadmap. If an organization can't tell you what they're going to be doing in the next 18 months and how that's going to help you, chances are good that they're in a maintenance mode and not necessarily interested in innovating. So as you're vetting your vendors, make sure you're talking about what's coming up, not necessarily just what the technology can do today. It also sparks ideas on your side and makes it more likely that you will stay ahead of the curve as well. The fourth one is longevity in the marketplace. This one is a little bit of a tricky one because some of the best innovation we've seen comes from smaller vendors that haven't been around very long. But longevity in the marketplace can give you a sense for how long it's going to continue to be in the marketplace. We had one organization, learning leader tell us that they looked for technologies or companies that had been in the market for about 5 years because they had proven that they'd be around for a little while, but they were also young and nimble enough to meet his needs and young and nimble enough to innovate. And then the final one is evidence of partnering. So not just supplying, but actually partnering. One leader of a multinational company said that what she does is she actually pulls vendors into the same room to solve some of her organizational challenges. So gone are the days when you're talking to each vendor separately and they're solving the problem from their point of view. She actually just pulls them all into a room and sits them down and says, I have this problem, let's go ahead and solve it. So for external sustainability, I wanted to show you Shopify. Shopify has a central group that basically acts as a broker to help the L&D groups within each of the businesses pull information together in order to make bigger purchases. So you can see that their ecosystem may not have a lot of technology in it, but what they do is they spend a lot of time with their internal stakeholders to make sure that those 5 points that we just made about the vendors are true, but also that the internal needs are going to be met for all of their L&D people internally. The other thing that I really like about this one in particular is they also use a lot of adopted tools. So not everything is a learning technology. They really take advantage of the adopted tools around that outer level to get some of the learning in their organization done. And then the final area that we heard a lot about was this idea of evolution. One of the leaders said we need to embrace the uncertainty, and that's really stuck with us because as we think about the idea of an ecosystem, the idea is about continuously changing to make sure that you meet the needs of the environment. And as we were talking to organizations, they said that they are consistently monitoring their ecosystems to make sure that they're meeting the needs. And they broke down kind of how they measure that or how they look at that into 3 big pieces. The first one is that user experience. So if the experience isn't good, the ecosystem won't be used. So the organization is constantly monitoring it to make sure that it's meeting employee needs. The second one is effectiveness. is the ecosystem actually helping to improve the performance and focusing on the skills that the organization is going to need in the future? And does it serve the needs of all of the employees? And then the third one is alignment. Is it aligned and is it cohesive? Does it share information with all the employees? Does it help people improve? Is it aligned with the needs of the individuals, but also is it aligned with the needs of the organization? Is it getting us what we need? And as we were asking for advice from individuals who were continuously evolving their ecosystem, they offered 3 pieces for us. The first one was to understand usage. And this one we've heard more and more and more lately, and it rolls into how you measure learning and what that means for your organization. It's hard to determine what is successful and what is not without cold, hard numbers. And so we should be looking at those numbers. When we looked at the learning technology space a little while ago, about 2/3 of the people that we polled, 2/3 of the vendors that we polled have some sort of analytics function built in. So there is data available. And I think that number should probably be higher, but the data exists. And so what we need to do is learn how to find it and learn what it means for us and how we need to adjust our ecosystem to enable people in the organization. The second thing we heard is divest to invest. The organizations that we admired the most are the ones that kept nothing sacred. So there was no relationship with a vendor that trumped the needs of the organization. If something wasn't working, organizations should sunset it and they should put something into place with a better chance of working. We did a panel last week, and Vidya Krishnan, who is the CLO of Ericsson, said something that really stuck with me. She said, sometimes things die and that's okay. I think sometimes we get so attached to this idea that we have or the ecosystem, the way that it exists, that we don't necessarily think that maybe the time of that particular technology is just up, or maybe it just doesn't serve the needs of our organization. And so her statement, sometimes things just die and that's okay, kind of gave us permission to think differently about what we're investing in. And so taking a look at what we are investing in and making sure that what we are investing in is serving a purpose. And if not, then getting rid of it and refunneling that money into something that can help. And then finally, and this was advice I wasn't necessarily expecting, but a lot of leaders told us to be decisive. Leaders told us that they intentionally make decisions quickly because too much indecision means that they were stalled and unable to take action. And if you think about how quickly that learning technology landscape changes, delaying a decision by 8 or 9 months can dump you into a place where the landscape looks completely different, or the needs of your organization look completely different. So as the world is moving that quickly, sometimes bad decisions are better than no decisions at all. And if you think about those last two, especially as partners, be decisive and then divest to invest. You're never stuck with one technology that isn't going to work. Make sure that you have an out and that you can try something out, and if it doesn't work, yank it and put something into place that does work, but be really decisive and make sure that you're staying on top of these decisions so that it never hobbles your organization. I want to show you one more example, and then we'll open it up for a few questions. This is Airbnb. This is one of the very first organizations I talked to about this idea of ecosystems, and that was about 4 years ago. They had started thinking about it before I had started thinking about it. I love the way that they're not afraid to uproot something that isn't working and to adopt a technology for something else. So one of the examples that he recently gave me was this plus plus. So plus plus helps to, the original purpose was to schedule in-person meetings or schedule in-person training events. That's what plus plus does. But Airbnb basically took plus plus and said, oh, we can use this for mentoring and coaching, and worked with plus plus to put in place something that would allow them to use it for mentoring and coaching, which both sides showed me and seems to work really well. And so Airbnb is really creative in the way that they see functionality in one tool and leverage it for leverage it to serve the purpose of a need that they have in another part of their overall strategy. And I think that's pretty cool. The other thing that they do incredibly well is that they continuously experiment. They're always trying things out, they're always measuring it, and then they're either proceeding or they're sunsetting. So just a quick recap of the 4 things to keep in mind. The world is changing incredibly fast and the expectations are higher and our choice is greater. And so as we're putting together learning tech ecosystems, we should be thinking about these 4 things. We should be thinking about philosophy, and specifically in that philosophy, we should be thinking about enabling, and we should be thinking about intentionally designing. We should be thinking about our structure and the needs that our organization has that structure can fulfill if we get it right. We should definitely be thinking about sustainability, both the stakeholders inside the organization to help us get the ecosystem the way that it needs to be, but also really, really leveraging our vendors, our vendor partners, to make sure that they can help us make our tech ecosystem sustainable. And then finally, evolution, which is another one that we didn't really consider when we started talking to the individuals, but evolution is incredibly important. We have to continually be yanking things out and putting things in so that we can meet the needs of the business and help them compete in the environment that they find themselves. As far as resources go, I just wanted to quickly flash this screen up here. We recently, I think I mentioned, we wrote this report, The Art and Science of Designing a Learning Technology Ecosystem. There is a nice little infographic that goes with it and sort of summarizes what we've talked today. The little scan me button will get you there immediately. And with that, Alec, I think we can open it up to some questions.
All right, Danny, thank you. We are going to get into some questions. We have a bit of time here now, so if you have a question, don't hesitate to submit. We already have some in here, but just click on that Q&A icon, type your question, and click submit. We're going to get started with one here from Deidre, and Deidre's question is, what is your strongest suggestion or method for simplifying the ecosystem?
That's a really good question. I mean, I hate to be dodgy about it, but I think it's really going to depend on what your organization needs. So we talked about the different structures. In some cases, the very best thing to do to simplify it is to just do a one platform solution. In other cases, simplifying may be taking the technology or integrating the technology with the way work is done. So in one organization we talked to that is a financial / technology company, one platform didn't work for them. It wasn't the simplest way because it was taking people out of the work, and so they integrated with the Slacks and the Teams and the other types of technology, Salesforce, and those other technologies that made it really easy for people to learn on a really quick basis. I think maybe the biggest piece of advice I have for you in determining kind of where you fit is, how are you most likely to create a signal through the noise? How are you most likely to access your learners, and then plan toward that?
All right, perfect, Danny, thank you. The next one comes from Joanna, and Joanna has a comment first, but then the question comes in here a little bit later. So it's interesting to hear that some companies seem to have more than one program that is accessible. I currently just got my program cut down with the intention to build it back up next year. What can I do if I'm part of that 25% who is struggling to maintain any budget for learning? Where is the best place that you think I should start?
Yeah, I would start with the performance of the organization, the skills and knowledge that people need in order to get that performance up, and then walk back from there. So if you can clearly identify where the organization is going and the skills and knowledge that they'll need, and then say, here's my plan for getting those knowledge and skills up, I need some support in order to do that, it's a stronger business case than the other way around.
All right, great. Randall has a question here, and the question is, our organization has compared several vendors for an LMS, but the vendors seem more interested in selling to us rather than helping us solve our problems. When searching and dealing with multiple vendors, how do you cut through that and get down to actual problem solving when it comes to choosing those vendors?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my first advice would be to go them and very specifically say, we need your help in this way. And the ones that aren't playing ball, just get rid of them. It's been amazing to me in the last year and a half. I've been asking the question, how do you fit into the larger tech ecosystem, to every vendor for the last 3 years? And it's amazing to me that when I talk to them now, they don't even hesitate before they are able to tell me. And so vendors that won't work with other vendors and vendors that won't work with you to solve your problems are no longer worth your time. That is table stakes. If they're not doing that, clear the queue and start again.
All right. Let me see here. I have a bunch of them coming in, so I'm trying to filter through these as best as possible. Danny, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Okay, so this one, the question is, have you seen any negative impacts from having the pure ecosystem?
Yes. I mean, I think the world is moving this way, but there are some drawbacks to it. It can be really confusing. It can be harder to draw a signal through the noise or make the signal clear through the noise. And multiple entry points can be really confusing. And so the biggest drawback, I think, is that it just requires a lot of thought and planning and integration with the systems that already exist, or you have complete chaos. Others are, the bigger your ecosystem is, the more vendors that you are dealing with, and managing those partnerships can kind of get confusing as well.
All right, perfect, Danny. Thank you. This next one comes from Richard, and Richard is asking, do you think the process discussed here today is better suited for a larger organization, or can it also be applied to smaller businesses and startups?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. When we went out and asked to interview people, we went to very large multinational corporations, and we always also went to really small ones and sort of everything in between. And so we wanted the best practices for putting a learning tech ecosystem in place no matter what. And I think we kind of arrived at that. The four things that we tell people to sort of think through are not definitive for one kind of organization. They're definitive based on the situation you find yourself in. And so I think it's really applicable to anybody that's trying to put together an ecosystem.
All right, this one here from John is kind of a version of a question that I get a lot, and it's about pushback from senior leadership. So John's question is, how do you handle the objection from senior leadership or IT when they say something along the lines of, no, we don't need that, we already have an LMS?
Yeah, and we heard this one a lot. I think there are two things going on. The first one is, these things cost money. That's just the way it is. And so building a business case to make sure that happens is really, really important. I think it does go back to the site. We're seeing, let me back up. We're seeing a huge sort of convergence of three things. We're seeing performance, career, and learning all sort of converge on each other, both in the tech space and in organizations as they start thinking about it and talking about it. It's one conversation now instead of three. And so as L&D leaders get more comfortable having the discussion about how what I'm doing now is going to affect the organization, and showing a path from where we are now as far as performance goes and where we can get if we implement this very carefully crafted plan, I think you're better off. I also think that the more specific you are, the better off you are. The second thing is, and I've said this a couple of times, but L&D just has an inferiority complex. I'm not sure exactly why, but the more data you have, the better your plan is, and the more just sort of confidence you have in the ability to affect the organization. And as you start talking about affecting the organization, not teaching people, the better your chances are of getting the support you need.
All right, Danny, we're moving right along. We still have some time, and we'll take a few more questions before we shut things down here today. But this one's going to come from Flores, and Flores's question is, what's your vision on LXPs who also have a lot of overlap in terms of functionality with other vendors in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we found, and I don't know that I can get back to that slide, but those 30 functionalities, I mean, we're seeing vendors that do coaching and scheduling. We're seeing vendors that do curation and scheduling, or curation and content creation. And so the world as we knew it even 5 years ago has completely changed. And so as we look at our vendors, it's important not just to say they can do these things, but what do they do that we already have in place? And if we are going to use both of them, which are we going to use? So it's not just one platform that does everything. It's one platform that may provide 60% of what we need, and then we're going to use other things because we think they're better solutions than what the platform can provide. And so getting out of the mindset of finding just an LXP, and instead looking at what we're trying to enable, which is the plan, the discover, the consume, the experiment, those sort of aspects of experience, and then determining which technology functions best in my culture to help enable that is the better question.
All right, cool, Danny. Thank you. We'll give it another minute or so for some more questions to come in. But while we're waiting, I want to take the time to let you all know again that this was being recorded. You're going to receive that recording in a follow-up email about 24 hours after the conclusion of the event. I also want to take this time to thank today's sponsors of this webinar over at Exonify, NovoEd, and Degreed. Always a pleasure to work with all three of those companies, and I really appreciate their support on today's event. All right, and while we're waiting here for these questions to come through, it looks like we have some coming in. So let me see if I can sort through these while we still have a little bit of time.
Sure. Alec, just a quick word on the sponsors. This was a first for us. We had 3 sponsors come together and say, hey, listen, this is important, and we are all in the learning tech space, and we understand we're part of an ecosystem, so let's do this together. That's the first time we've ever sort of seen that, and I think it speaks to the way that the learning tech space is thinking about it, as well as the way that organizations need to start thinking about it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I run our webinar program here, and this is almost a first for me to have 3 sponsors come together on a common webinar. So it's very refreshing to see that. I have a question here from Martin. Martin's question is, how do you measure the actual learning results when a lot of platforms only focus on content?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We actually just barely finished a study on learning impact, like how learning organizations are actually having impact, not just showing impact. I'd probably point you to the RedThread site to download that, or shoot me an email here and I can get that to you. The short answer is it's harder. It's much, much harder. So if every single tech vendor that you're talking to has their own sort of analytics function, and a lot of them focus on how much was consumed versus other types of measures, we need to take that data and figure out what that means for our organization. So if people were consuming this, does that correlate in some way to an actual change in the organization? Does it correlate to a change in behavior? We have to actually do that work, and it's hard. I'll be honest with you. What we found from that research is that it's hard, but really doable. So if you want to contact me separately, I'm happy to send that to you.
All right, great. Well, Danny, I think we're going to cut things a little bit short today. Just about 10 minutes before our scheduled end time, but I do want to be respectful of everybody's time, and this is giving back people a little bit of time in their day. So I appreciate you, Danny, for taking the time to be with us today. Again, I appreciate all 3 sponsors at Exonify, NovoEd, and Degreed, and I appreciate everybody for joining today's call and for all of your participation. If you enjoyed the webinar, please take a moment to fill out a brief post-event survey that's going to appear right as this webinar ends. Your feedback is important to us here at CLO, and it'll help us improve our events going forward, especially moving into 2020. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you all back here for our next CLO webinar, which will be tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, and that is titled Micro, Mobile, and Measured, Our Learning Beyond the Classroom Strategy for the iGen Workforce. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.